Hey there, and welcome to this explainer, where we're going to decode the totally fascinating, highly complex, and frankly, kind of contradictory relationship between two of the world's most populous nations. We're talking about India and China, two absolute giants that share a massive border and together represent way over a third of the entire global population. Before we really get into the weeds, let's just take a quick second to appreciate the sheer massive scale of this topic. We're looking at two ancient civilizational states with sturdy historical legacies, billions of citizens, and a geopolitical chessboard that is constantly shifting. And, understanding this dynamic isn't just for high-level political junkies. It literally dictates global supply chains, the prices of the stuff we buy every single day, and the very security of the world's oceans. So let's get into it. All right, here's our roadmap for today. First, from friendship to fracture. Second, the path towards normalization. Third, the yin and yang. Fourth, the global chessboard. And finally, shaping the Indo-Pacific. Starting off with section 1, from friendship to fracture. To really grasp where India and China are at today, we actually have to rewind the clock back to the 1940s and 50s. This was a time of real shared anti-imperialist solidarity that, unfortunately, unraveled pretty fast. Just think about the early days. You've got Rabindranath Tagore visiting China in 1924, which left a huge impression on Chinese intellectuals. By 1927, Jawaharlal Nehru is in Brussels meeting with a Chinese delegation, totally connecting on their shared perspectives on imperialism. India even stepped up as the first Asian non-communist country to recognize the new regime in China. But then, well, the crux of the problem emerged, and that was Tibet. In 1950, China consolidated military control of Tibet. And sure, India formally renounced its traditional privileges there in 1954 with the Panchsheel Agreement, which laid out 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, but relations were stretched to the absolute breaking point by 1959. That's when the Tibetan government in exile set up shop in Dharamsala, India. The Chinese strongly suspected an Indian dual policy of secretly supporting resistance, and just like that, the shared post-colonial camaraderie completely vanished. And this tension didn't just simmer, it exploded into full-blown war. In late 1961, India started a proactive policy to set up posts in territory it claimed as its own, while the Chinese responded incredibly swiftly. In 1962, they successfully pushed Indian troops south of the McMahon Line in the eastern Himalayas, and at the same time seized control of the high-altitude desert of Aksai Chin out in the west. Then, just as suddenly as it started, China declared a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew. Ambassadors were recalled. So the big takeaway here is just how incredibly fast that 1962 border conflict completely shattered their fraternal friendship. It plunged ties into this deep freeze, setting up literally decades of mistrust where China would even go on to support insurgencies in India's northeast and forge tight alliances with Pakistan. Moving on to section 2, path towards normalization. Let's jump to the next era and see how this transitions into a slow and honestly pretty painful thaw in relations, despite all that lingering historical baggage. Just think about the sheer weight of time behind this moment. In 1988, Rajiv Gandhi became the second Indian prime minister to visit China. The first, that was Nehru, exactly 30 years prior. When Gandhi met with Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, he famously declared, "It is now time to look into the future. I have come to renew an old friendship." This meeting was an absolute game changer. It signaled a real, genuine desire from the very top to regularize diplomatic exchanges and rebuild ties across culture, trade, and academia. Now, this renewal definitely didn't happen overnight. It was very much a step-by-step grind. In 1991, Chinese Premier Li Peng visited India, reaffirming a desire to stabilize the neighborhood. There were for sure some major bumps in the road, like India's 1998 nuclear tests, which definitely irked China. The wild part? The Indian Prime Minister actually cited China as the reason for the tests in a letter to the U.S. president, but they pushed through it. By 2003, Prime Minister Vajpayee's visit brokered a much more rational shift regarding the boundary dispute. And then in 2005, Premier Wen Jiabao's visit yielded a massive diplomatic win. China finally officially recognized Sikkim as a part of India, and they formally announced a strategic and cooperative partnership. That brings us to section 3, the yin and yang. This brings us perfectly into the modern era, and the absolute core paradox that defines how these two giants interact today. Analysts call it the yin and yang. We need to define this exactly as the researchers do. Basically, the collapse of the socialist bloc and the massive wave of economic globalization pushed both of these nations to modernize. But the result is this wild paradox. You have a booming, multi-level economic partnership, that is completely at odds with deep-seated security suspicions and remarkably low levels of mutual trust. So let's talk about the yin of this relationship, which is just sheer economic dynamism. Between 2000 and 2012, India-China trade in goods was literally the world's fastest-growing trade relationship. At a staggering 29.7% growth rate, China actually blew past the United States to become India's largest trading partner in 2009. The economic engagement expanded so rapidly that Chinese business presence in Asia has been described by some experts as Asia's best-kept secret. But then we've flipped the coin to the yang, and it tells a wildly different story. India has these growing, really severe concerns over a continuous and rising trade deficit that has just been climbing since 2005. On top of that, India's export basket to China is incredibly limited. We're talking mostly just primary products, like raw materials rather than finished goods. And here's the kicker. India is highly competitive globally in sectors like pharmaceuticals and IT, yet they constantly hit a brick wall trying to get market access for these specific sectors in China. So you've got this massive volume of trade, but it's highly skewed, which really just reinforces that underlying lack of trust we talked about. Section 4. The global chessboard. Beyond just bilateral trade, both of these countries are rapidly expanding their global footprints. Because they're both rising powers, their ambitions are inevitably leading to a highly complex multilateral dance. This new great game is intensely complicated. For instance, China is developing a massive, long-term geoeconomic relationship with India's direct rival, Pakistan, through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. Why? Because Pakistan gives China direct access to the Indian Ocean, helping them completely bypass the vulnerable Malacca Strait, which is a critical global shipping choke point that could easily be blocked if a conflict broke out. China also really wants to integrate Asia's supply chains around itself. India, on the other hand, views this as a major geopolitical imbalance and is actively counterbalancing. They're heavily pursuing rapprochement with the United States and expanding security partnerships with regional democracies like Japan and Australia, all while trying to maintain their own strategic autonomy as a middle power. And because of this delicate balancing act, their multilateral engagement is incredibly divergent. It's totally fascinating how they actually cooperate on some global platforms. For example, they take joint stands on the WTO, environmental issues, and UN reforms. They're both highly active in organizations like BRICS, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Yet, when it comes down to geoeconomics, India draws a very hard line. Case in point, India voluntarily pulled out of RCEP, which is a massive China-backed Asian free trade agreement, because they realized that integrating their economy into a China-centric supply chain was seriously detrimental to their own interests. Instead, India is actively seeking to cut domestic economic dependencies on China and aggressively attract foreign investors who are looking to diversify away from Chinese supply chains. Which leads us to our final section, Section 5, Shaping the Indo-Pacific. All of these economic, diplomatic, and multilateral maneuvers ultimately converge on one massive geographic theater, the strategic waters of the Indo-Pacific. So let's ask the critical question that security analysts are obsessing over right now. How do these shifting alliances and economic rivalries actually play out in the maritime domain? Because this is where the world's most vital military and trade routes intersect, meaning this directly affects the goods delivered to your doorstep every single day. Basically, it creates a profound maritime security dilemma. India looks at China's port developments across the region, what's often called the String of Pearls, and is deeply, deeply wary of being encircled in the Indian Ocean. To counter this, India goes ahead and finalizes foundational defense agreements with the U.S., but then China looks at those exact same U.S.-India defense agreements and views them as a major threat to its own geopolitical interests. The result? The competition is physically moving into the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. For India, the ultimate outcome of the broader systemic rivalry between the U.S. and China is going to dictate whether it can actually become an established power in the region. If they don't navigate this perfectly, they risk being completely overshadowed by a Chinese-dominated Fourth Industrial Revolution. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. We have two civilizational states, both rising and both with incredibly long memories of friendship and fracture. As they navigate this shared geopolitical space in the Indo-Pacific, will their relationship ultimately be defined by a quest for mutual prosperity through that booming trade? Or will their deep-seated security suspicions lead to inevitable confrontation? How they answer that question won't just define Asia, it will literally shape the future of the world.